So how do you face fear? And I say face fear instead of beat fear because to try and beat fear is just to give more momentum to that which was about to diminish. Fear itself is, all fears stem to the main one fear, right? Which is that of death. That I, this illusionary self, that is separate from the whole. I am going to die. I am lacking. Right? So, to try and beat fear is to take that illusionary self that feels like it's about to diminish, right? And just go back into the source, which is happiness and love. It's funny because on the other side of this, what appears to be terrifying edge is happiness, contentment, a state of being which is just love. A wholeness, I guess you could say, right? Because there's no longer this illusionary self, it's just wholeness. So if you try to beat fear, you're just making this illusionary self a little bit cocky, a little bit more reassured again. So briefly, this feeling of fear fades, right? But it comes back. You beat it a lot of times, you've beat it many times, but it always comes back. And that's because you haven't really faced it. You haven't really faced yourself. Which is that feeling of lack and fear. Aloneness in a sense. Loneliness. Because let's say, you're afraid you're not going to be able to pay your bills this week. Even that, at the core, is the fear of death. Because if you don't pay your bills, you won't have a roof over your head, and you won't have nothing to eat, and then, you will die. So, if you have a fear that your kids don't go to college, what's that at the core? If they don't go to college, they won't be successful, they're not successful, they won't have a place, they don't have a place, they're not going to have food, nowhere to stay, they're going to die. So all fears stem to the main one fear, which is that of death. Which isn't to say you shouldn't care, right? This is just to say you shouldn't act from a place of fear. For example, most people are afraid of what will happen if they're no longer afraid. They're afraid of not being afraid. They will say, well, if no one's afraid, if nobody cares about what happens to the starving people in Africa, what then? What are we going to do then? If no one's afraid about what will happen to them, what will we do then? Which is implying that if you're acting from compassion, that you're going to forget about those starving people in Africa, that you're no longer going to do anything. But that's wrong. Those people are more likely going to do something about it. It's just you're no longer acting from a place of something that you do not want, resistance. And you're more so acting from a place of what you're for. It's very significant. There's a big difference there. So even if you're not acting in a feeling of fear, you can still be acting from fear, from a place of fear. If I'm not afraid of what will happen to these people, then what's going to happen to them? You're acting from a place of fear in that. You're not acting from a place of wholeness, from a place of what you're for. But you could still, in that same way, want to save those people in Africa, right? But not be in it from a place of resistance and just despair and fear. You can do it from a place of compassion. So to try and beat fear in that same way is just a resistance of it, right? That's why it doesn't work. That's why it doesn't transform it. Because if you really watch fear, prior to the thoughts that rise about it, fear itself is neutral, the feeling of it. It's not necessarily positive or negative. It just feels like you're coming to a point where you're about to go into something unknown, which is just this selflessness, this place that you've been many times. It's just a place where this illusionary self can't exist, where it can't be. So when it starts to feel itself fade like that into it, it feels as if it's losing itself, right? So it's not that you can beat fear in that way. You have to look at it with a curiosity, because once you start creating a thought about it, it becomes overwhelming. Then it seems as if it's negative, right? But prior to any thought, like I said, prior to this, the feeling is more so neutral. It's not positive or negative. It's not overwhelming itself. You feel fear, and you're still okay. You're still there. You're not overwhelmed. It's once you start thinking about it, identifying with thought, and that it feels overwhelming. So you have to look at it with a curiosity. You can't look at it as if it's an enemy. An enemy you never really look in the face. You never really want to look dead in the eyes. There's no investigation to that. But a lover, you can look dead in the eyes. You can look them straight in the face and really go into them, investigate them, right? So that's how you have to look at, how you have to sit with your fear, with the curiosity. No resistance to it. You have to face fear. And in facing it, you just find that it's a fear of losing yourself. This idea that was never there in the first place. And if you just sit with it and go into it, it just plunges back into the source, which is what you are. You plunge back into what is real, your whole self. And there is no absences in that. There's no fear. That's all fear is. It's an absence, right? Love and fear are not two separate things. Just in the same way that darkness and light, or hot and cold, are not two separate things. Hot and cold are just lesser or more degrees of the same one phenomenon. And by law of thermodynamics, there's no such thing as cold. There's just lesser or more degrees of heat. In the same way that darkness is not an opposite to light, it is an absence of light. If it was an opposite, I could take a handful of darkness and throw it on a candle and put out the light, but I can't. It's an absence of light. Just lesser or more degrees of the same one phenomenon, which is light. So love and fear in that same way are not two. Fear is not an opposite, it is an absence of wholeness, of awareness, of that selflessness, right? Because on the contrary, as soon as you create this illusionary self, now you are separate. Now you are lacking something. Now you're unwhole. Now you're an absence, right? It wouldn't appear that way. As long as you have yourself, you feel like nothing is absent. But as long as you're an illusion of self, separation from what you are, which is the whole, you are an absence, fear, lack. And that's why emotions, in this sense, feelings, they stem from the main two, which are not two but one. Anything that is joy, contentment, love, calm, compassion, all stem from that love, that wholeness, right? And anything that is anxiety, worry, hate, anger, all stem from fear, this illusionary self, this feeling of lack and fear, that you either need to dominate somebody or that you're going to be dominated. So in facing fear, you're really facing yourself. And you can't look at it as if it's an enemy. You can't look at it as if it's a negative thing. Because remember, fear itself is not overwhelming. It's the thoughts that you let arise after it and identify with. Instead of staying present with it, you go into the mind and just start thinking, and now this feeling you're experiencing is just terrifying. So don't look at it like you're even trying to get rid of it. Don't look at it with a resistance. And totally accepting it, it just diminishes itself. And you can't really say in the first place that it was ever there. It's just an absence of wholeness. So you can't really say that it would be discarded forever, because it was never really there in the first place. It's just you will no longer ever again have an absence in you. You will be whole. And I say that because I could see where if I say, you discard fear and it never arises again, I know a lot of people will come at it and look at it like, well, there's nothing to be discarded, right? Remember? There is nothing to be discarded, especially something like desire that's just to be transformed. But how can you sacrifice or discard or transform, really, even something like the ego, this illusionary self, or fear that was never there in the first place? It's just an absence. You can't sacrifice the ego, because there's nothing there to sacrifice. It's an idea, it's an imagination of yourself, which creates that feeling of lack and fear. So you can't sacrifice that, right? You can only see it for what it is and no longer believe in it in that way. You see what you are, and that is discarded, because the illusion of it is discarded. So I guess you could say, going into fear, facing it, you see it for what it is, which is that you're just afraid to lose yourself. And in losing yourself, you find yourself. It's not that anything is discarded. It's like if you were doing the math, 3 plus 3, and getting 7. And then you find out 3 plus 3 is 6. It's not that anything was ever lost. Nothing was ever discarded. Right? It's just that it was always 6. It was never 7. So it may feel as if something's lost when you're facing this, but nothing's being lost at all. You were just doing the math wrong prior to. It wasn't 7, it was 6. And in reality, you've gained something. You've gained the whole. You've gained yourself, the whole. Insight, recognition. There's no loss to it. Just like you would think, well, if you go from 7 to 6, you've lost something. No, it was always 6. Nothing is lost. So if you go into this, if you face yourself, if you had this recognition I speak of, and you're afraid to stay with it and keep going into it, you feel like something might be lost. That's false. And even me saying this, it'll take a while to sit with that and then keep facing it, possibly, and be able to actually do it. But it's to say that if you continue to face it and sit with it, sit in that recognition, become naked with it, you just deeply recognize how it was just always 6 in that way. There's nothing you're losing. You're gaining the whole. You are coming back to what you are. It no longer feels like you're facing some kind of fear. Just more so yourself, your nature, your being. And at first, of course, that's going to feel alien, isn't it? Because you've never really sat with yourself, which is the whole, and that recognition. So it almost feels alien to yourself. It almost feels unnatural, like scary, but it's just an unknown feeling because you haven't been there since you were born. When you're born, you're there, right? You're in this place of selflessness. For the first, I think, 3 months or so, you don't even know you're separate from the mother. You're just sensation, perception, hearing. You're not even thinking at that point. You're just being. But this is all in ignorance, right? It's not an awareness. So this Buddhahood is false. It's an ignorance. That's why whenever you come back to this and you face your fear, you have this recognition. It seems unknown but familiar at the same time. Because you have been there before. It's what you are. It's just almost as if you forgot. And the more you look at it, I just kind of had, this recognition myself. And fear itself is just almost a fear of remembering. Right? Let that sink in.